Welcome to our RDF Church podcast. This is our Midweek Connection where we go deeper into the sermon that we heard this past Sunday. We really hope that this podcast and this week's discussion encourages you as you grow deeper into your relationship with God and as you get to know our church family closer and closer. We really hope you enjoy. Well, welcome back, everyone, to our Midweek Connection podcast. Today we have Chris.
How's it going?
Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure. Happy to do it.
Yeah. Last week, or this past week, you talked about faith and doubt and how those two intersect, specifically in Mark 9.
Yeah.
And I know for myself, doubt has been something that has been prominent in my faith journey. When I got saved in my senior year of high school, I found myself in the same shoes as the boy's dad. It's like, I believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. You know what I mean? There were still things about, just a life with Christ that didn't make sense to me or just wasn't appealing. But I loved how you presented just how doubt fits in all of that. And I think that when we I don't want to say normalize doubt, but make it less of a taboo, that opens up more of a conversation. What do you think about that? I mean,
yeah, I think so. And we all carry different stories, right? So my story never involved a radical departure from church. I never really left faith, but that also doesn't mean I didn't have seasons of doubt. I definitely did. And I still remember, and it seems silly now, but the time was actually fairly traumatic. I remember being in high school and listening to a sermon from my senior pastor, and I had this thought in my head, wait a minute, I disagree with my senior pastor about something. He had mentioned something in his sermon that it was small and fairly insignificant, but I didn't agree. And I had this crisis of, can I disagree with my senior pastor on something? Can we have a different opinion on things, right? Because to that point, I just always assumed more or less that Christians just always believed exactly the same thing and thought about things exactly the same way. And then you go to college and you realize that even among the Christian world, there's a lot of different opinions about a lot of the different facets of what faith is. And that's really unsettling, even without a radical departure from the church, right? Even just that by itself. And so trying to figure out what that means, I had to recalibrate even my own faith. Even if I didn't leave, my faith looked different probably over the course of that 5-year period than it did before. And I would say it's stronger and richer and deeper, but it's unsettling when you're going through it, right? And so for all of us, I think what you're saying is right. When we're able to be honest about the fact that doubt is part of our journey, that as we're learning from other people, as we're learning from what we read in Scripture, as we're trying to reconcile faith in this world, that doubt's part of that. If we can acknowledge it, then I think that it's safer for us to actually learn from each other, to kind of bolster each other up through the process, rather than pretend like we've all got this perfectly figured out version of faith all the time.
Yeah. I think that's something that I know for myself that kind of barred me from stepping into a life with Christ earlier, just because I don't know, there's this false expectation in my mind that like I had to get everything right.
Sure.
I had to get all of my, my ducks in a row before jumping into a life with Christ. And I mean, honestly though, to be completely open, as soon as I stepped into that life with Christ, the people around me didn't, it still made me feel like I needed my ducks in a row, things like that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It didn't all go away.
Right. It didn't really all go away for myself, But, I had pastors around me, that, when I was like, I don't know if I completely agree with you, exactly what you were saying with your senior pastor, they still stepped alongside of me and said, that's okay. You know what I mean?
And they made it safe. And so you can have the conversation.
Yeah. It seems like with doubt, there needs to be room for safety, as you brought up just right now.
I think so. One of the things I know is really difficult for particularly for, I'll say, the parents of college students and late high school students and young adults in our church, is that they can sometimes see their kids, their adult children, going through different kinds of struggles about what faith means in their life. Mm-hmm. And what I've seen is that parents can kind of tense up at that moment because the stakes are high. Mm-hmm. And so there's this question, like, is my child losing their faith, right? And so when stakes are that high, we don't always act out of our best selves. Sometimes we actually show some of our worst selves, and we can dig our heels in. But the parents I've seen that have really walked well with their adult children through that phase have been the ones that have created the safe space. The ones where they've said, I love you no matter what. And you know what? I think your faith should be different by the time you become a 30-year-old than what it was when you were 15. It should look different. Yeah. And to allow that to kind of flourish and blossom.
Yeah. I've been really pondering that idea of including the doubt as you were building the Lego image, including that doubt along with the things that we are very, very confident in. And I think having that mind shift, for me, that was a game changer. You know what I mean? I felt that, but seeing that in front of me when you were building that, I was like, wow, yes.
You're talking about my very last model where the red brick lived with everything else.
The red brick lived with the green and the blue. Like, everything was just like, oh man, that creates more of an honest self,
right?
At least for me,
I agree. I think that a lot of the times when we're going through, and doubt is such a loaded word, which is hard, which is sometimes why I like the word conflict almost better, because doubt feels like this big, fully encumbering thing where usually we're talking about individual conflicts, like how do I reconcile my faith with evolution or some other thing, like, right? And so there tend to be smaller bricks a lot of the times. And what we oftentimes find is that we end up not caring about that conflict. Sometimes. Some of them we're just prepared to live with. Like, I don't fully have that reconciled, but it's such a small part of my faith, I'm okay letting that sit there undetermined, unfinished, and I can still build a life with Christ even without that particular brick fully resolved.
Yeah. It's amazing because I feel like we often hold on to the things that we know in this world on this side of heaven so tightly to where I feel like, this might be crazy to say, but I feel like when we are in the full presence of God in heaven, you know what I mean? We're going to be completely thrown off by what we thought was real and what we thought was false. It was fake. You know what I mean?
There is a book that C.S. Lewis wrote called Until We Have Faces, and it's largely this giant parable. And if you read it, it's really wordy. It takes a long time to get to the end, but sort of the climactic moment at the end is the protagonist actually comes face to face with her true self. And all the lies that she told to herself throughout the book, that sounded really convincing. Like, the whole book, you're like, I can get on board with that. But all those lies that sounded so convincing at the time, at the very end, she's staring face to face with God and her own self, who she really is. And all those illusions melt away. And when she sees reality for what it really is, it completely rocks her world and kind of the rest of her life.
Yeah. I wonder what that'll look like, and I wonder how that would look like in our community if we allow ourselves to kind of loosen our grip on certain things where we thought, this is how it is, this is what it is, and then, allowing God to really speak into that, because I feel like our pursuit is after the pursuit of the absolute truth, but I feel like our pursuit should be after being with Christ more.
So, and this is something I've talked about a couple years ago, but I think it's worth coming back to. We have to be careful with kind of what we put in the non-negotiable box, and here's what I mean. There's certain parts of our faith that really are non-negotiable, right? Jesus, buried and raised, is non-negotiable to us, right? We don't get to play with that. When we talked about faith not being just anything, that is a concrete hope that we believe in Jesus, buried and resurrected, and that he conquered sin and death. But there's a lot of other things that feel weighty, but really are just an opinion, or maybe if they're really strong, maybe a conviction, but they're not quite the gospel. And so we have to separate those things a little bit so we don't get completely stuck on things that really are secondary to what the gospel is. And it's not like I can tell you exactly which things go in which box all the time. There's disagreement about where to put things in the boxes, but we do have to be careful not to make everything the weight of the gospel when we're talking about it.
Yeah. I think that's something to really always think about ourselves, have that thought present in our minds, and how that relates to ourselves and how that relates to everyone around us. Because I will say that when I had that mind shift, for me, it affected the way that I viewed everyone. You know, not even just my close community, but everyone that I was walking around, you know, in public. My mind just shifted and was like, oh my gosh, yeah. You know, it made me more open to people, made me more open to sitting down and talking with people. And, you know, the guards that I had up, they just fell down when I thought about that.
I think it'll be easier to talk to people when we realize that whatever doubts and conflicts we have, we're talking to people that have their own doubts and conflicts. They might be different than ours, but they have them. We're rarely talking to someone who feels like they've just got it all figured out.
Right.
And they might be lying to themselves if they actually do feel like they've got it all figured out too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so there's a sympathy, there's an empathy about a common struggle that we have where we want to be people of integrity. We want to live out lives that make sense across the board. We don't want to be duplicitous. We don't want to be double-minded. But it's hard because there's just so many things going on in our world, and the gospel is so vast that fitting that all together sometimes takes a while to kind of reconcile in our hearts.
Yeah. That's. I feel like that's a perfect way to end. That the gospel is so vast that if we think that we can fit all of it in our, you know, own mind and try to make sense of all of it, then is that really the gospel?
Sure.
You know,
it's always going to be bigger than us.
Yeah.
And that's scary sometimes, but that's the awesome thing about the faith journey.
Yes, it definitely is. Yeah. Well, I hope that's awesome for you, and I hope that that's comforting for you. So we thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope that this was an encouragement to you. So we'll see you next week.